Arab executive forced to marry an African woman. The honeymoon turned into a love story. He never imagined a powerful Arab executive, accustomed to control and independence, is suddenly forced into a marriage he never wanted. Bound by family traditions, he must now share his life with a woman he barely knows, an African beauty with a strong spirit and unshakable confidence. Their honeymoon was meant to be just an obligation, a trip to fulfill expectations before they returned to their separate lives. But fate had other plans. What starts as cold distance and resistance soon transforms into something neither of them ever expected. What happens when two powerful personalities clash? Will love find its way where it was never meant to exist? Stay until the end. You won't believe the shocking twist in this love story. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring you more inspiring stories like this one. The gold-threaded embroidery on his wedding robe felt suffocating, but not as much as the weight pressing down on his chest. Sheikh Zayed Al Fahad, a 35-year-old billionaire Arab executive, stood rigid at the altar, his jaw locked, his fingers clenched at his sides. In front of him stood Amina Diallo, the African woman he was being forced to marry. Her posture was regal, her deep brown eyes unwavering, but there was no warmth in them, only quiet defiance. This was not love. This was a business transaction arranged by their families, one that neither of them had a say in. Zayd had spent years building his empire, controlling markets, shaping industries, bending the world to his will. Yet today, in this grand palace adorned with shimmering chandeliers and flower arrangements worth millions, he had no control over his own fate. His father, Sheikh Khalil, had given him no choice. For the legacy of our family, you will marry her. Those words had sealed his fate. Amina, on the other hand, was the daughter of a powerful African business magnate. Her family owned vast diamond and gold mines, making them one of the wealthiest and most influential families in Africa. A perfect alliance on paper. But Zayd didn't care about perfect. As the Imam recited the wedding vows, his mind raced. This was not supposed to happen. He had always believed that when he married, it would be on his own terms, to a woman of his choice. Instead, he was here, forced to vow loyalty to a woman he didn't even know. Do you, Sheikh Zayed Al Fahad, take Amina Diallo as your lawfully wedded wife? Silence. The room full of dignitaries, royals, and elite business tycoons waited. His father's piercing gaze bore into him from across the hall. The pressure was unbearable. Finally, Zayd exhaled sharply. I do. Amina did not hesitate when her turn came. I do. Her voice was clear, unwavering. The moment the ceremony was over, Zayd turned to Amina, his voice low and cold. You do not have to pretend to be happy. We both know this is nothing more than a deal between our families. Amina arched an eyebrow. You think I wanted this? She took a step closer, her presence commanding. You are not the only one who had dreams, Sheikh Zayd, but here we are. He wasn't sure what he expected, anger, tears, or perhaps even desperation. But she was calm, composed, and just as unwilling as he was. The wedding reception was a grand affair. Dubai's most prestigious figures filled the ballroom, champagne flowed, and a live orchestra played soft classical melodies. But Zayd felt suffocated, drowning in expectations he had never agreed to. When the time came, a sleek private jet was waiting for them. Destination, the Maldives. The honeymoon had been prearranged, a full 2 weeks, in an ultra-luxurious private island resort, with no escape. Zaid had no intention of pretending. He would tolerate her presence, but there would be no romance, no emotion, nothing beyond obligation. As they boarded the jet, Amina's expression remained unreadable. She settled into her seat across from him, elegantly composed, as if this were just another business trip. For the first time in his life, Zaid couldn't read the person in front of him, and something about that unnerved him. He told himself it didn't matter. This was just a contract, nothing more. What he didn't know was that the honeymoon would change everything. The private jet soared through the night sky, its interior bathed in soft golden lighting. Zaid sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse of clouds outside the window. Across from him, Amina remained composed, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken a word since they left Dubai. The tension between them was palpable. This was supposed to be their honeymoon, but there was no warmth, no celebration. Just two strangers bound by duty, forced into a marriage neither had chosen. A stewardess approached, offering champagne. Amina accepted hers with a polite nod, but Zaid waved his away. His thoughts were too heavy for celebration. "You don't drink?" Amina asked, finally breaking the silence. "I do, just not tonight." She took a slow sip, her eyes studying him over the rim of her glass. "So, how exactly do you plan on surviving 2 weeks with me?" Zaid's jaw tightened. "We tolerate each other. We fulfill our obligations to our families. And then, when we return, we go back to our separate lives." Amina set her glass down on the table between them. "So, you expect me to be invisible?" "If that's possible, yes." A small, humorless smile tugged at her lips. "Unfortunately for you, Sheikh Zaid, I don't disappear on command." His eyes met hers, and for the first time he realized she wasn't just some woman forced into his life. She was a force of her own. There was no desperation in her, no submissiveness. She wasn't intimidated by him, nor was she trying to please him. That irritated him. The rest of the flight passed in silence. When they landed in the Maldives, a private yacht was waiting to take them to the island. The ocean stretched endlessly around them, its deep blue waters reflecting the moonlight. The island itself was breathtaking, white sand, lush greenery, and overwater villas that looked like something out of a dream. As they stepped onto the dock, a team of resort staff greeted them with flower leaves and soft, traditional music. Amina accepted hers with a graceful nod, but Zaid ignored his, moving ahead without acknowledging the welcoming ceremony. Inside their villa, everything was designed for romance. Candlelit pathways, a bed adorned with red rose petals, a private infinity pool overlooking the ocean. It was a paradise meant for lovers. But there was no love here. Zaid loosened his tie and walked toward the balcony, inhaling the salty ocean breeze. Amina set her suitcase down, glancing around before finally speaking. "We should set some ground rules." He turned, arms crossed. "Rules?" "Yes. If we're going to be stuck here together, let's at least establish some boundaries." He gestured for her to continue, curious about what she had to say. "First, you don't have to pretend to like me, but you will treat me with respect. If you have nothing decent to say, keep it to yourself." Zaid smirked. "Is that all? Second, I don't need your money or your generosity. If you're planning to use wealth as a way to control me, don't bother." He narrowed his eyes. "And what makes you think I would try to control you?" She took a step closer, her gaze steady. Because men like you think they can control everything. Her words hit deeper than he expected. She wasn't wrong. He had built an empire by controlling every detail, ensuring nothing was left to chance. But here she was, standing before him, a woman he couldn't manipulate, couldn't intimidate. A silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Zaid finally let out a dry laugh. Fine. You want rules? Here's mine. Don't expect anything from me. No affection, no conversations beyond what's necessary. We're strangers, and when this honeymoon is over, that's how we'll remain. Amina nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. Fair enough. Without another word, she picked up her bag and walked toward the separate bedroom that had been arranged for her. Before she closed the door, she turned back to him one last time. You might think you have everything planned, Sheikh Zaid, but not everything in life goes according to your will. Then, she was gone, leaving him alone on the balcony, staring out at the endless ocean. For the first time in years, Zaid felt something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. He had expected a silent, obedient wife. Instead, he had been given a woman who challenged him. And deep down, something told him that this honeymoon would not go as planned. The next morning, Zaid woke up to the sound of waves gently crashing against the shore. Sunlight streamed through the sheer white curtains, casting a golden glow across the room. For a moment, he had almost forgotten where he was. Then, reality settled in. He was on his honeymoon, with a woman he barely knew. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. Everything about this arrangement felt suffocating. He had no patience for romance, no interest in playing the role of a doting husband. He would endure these 2 weeks, then return to Dubai and continue life as if this never happened. As he stepped out onto the villa's balcony, the ocean stretched endlessly before him, a deep blue horizon, untouched by his turmoil. The air was warm, laced with the scent of salt and tropical flowers. Then he saw her. Amina was already outside, standing by the infinity pool, wearing a flowing white dress that moved lightly with the breeze. Her dark skin glowed under the morning sun, and her natural curls framed her face in a way that made her look effortlessly regal. She didn't acknowledge him. She was drinking coffee, staring at the ocean as if she were completely alone. For some reason, that irritated him. She was his wife now. Shouldn't she at least acknowledge his presence? Shaking off the thought, Zaid turned and headed inside. He had no intention of playing the part of a newlywed couple. He would spend the day on his own, work remotely if necessary, and avoid unnecessary interactions. But his plans were shattered the moment he entered the dining area. A private chef had prepared an elaborate breakfast, fresh fruit, buttery croissants, golden honey, and perfectly brewed Arabic coffee. Everything was arranged for 2. Amina walked in a moment later, raising an eyebrow at the sight of him. "I assumed you'd eat in your room," she said, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. Zaid sat across from her, picking up his coffee. "And I assumed you'd be one of those women who play the role of a perfect wife. I see, I was wrong." Amina let out a soft chuckle. "Oh, Sheikh Zaid, I have no interest in being anyone's perfect anything." He smirked, amused despite himself. "Good, because I have no interest in playing the part of a perfect husband." Silence stretched between them as they ate, neither of them bothering with forced small talk. The tension was there, thick and unyielding, but something about it was oddly intriguing. Halfway through breakfast, Amina set down her fork and leaned back in her chair. "Let's make a deal." Zaid glanced up. A deal? Yes. We both know this marriage is nothing but an obligation, so instead of making these next 2 weeks miserable, why don't we agree to coexist peacefully? No hostility, no insults, just two strangers forced into paradise together. Zaid sipped his coffee, considering. And what do you get out of this arrangement? She tilted her head. 2 weeks of sanity. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fine. But let's be clear, this changes nothing. When we leave this island, we go back to being nothing more than business associates. Agreed. Amina extended her hand. Zaid hesitated before shaking it, surprised by the warmth of her skin. For a brief second, their eyes met. Something passed between them, an unspoken challenge, an unacknowledged curiosity, but neither of them dared to name it. After breakfast, they went their separate ways. Zaid retreated to his office space inside the villa, catching up on work calls and reviewing business reports. Amina, on the other hand, spent the morning exploring the island. By afternoon, Zaid had enough of staring at numbers. He needed air, a distraction. He stepped outside and found Amina lounging on a beach chair, reading a book. She looked at peace, unaffected by their situation. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt the sudden urge to disrupt that peace. He walked toward her, hands in his pockets. You're really enjoying yourself, aren't you? Amina glanced up from her book. Shouldn't I be? We're in paradise, after all. He sat on the chair next to hers. Most women in your position would be devastated. A forced marriage? An uninterested husband? She smirked. You think you're the first man to underestimate me, Sheikh Zaid? He narrowed his eyes. I don't underestimate you. I just don't understand you. Amina closed her book and turned to face him fully. Then maybe you should stop assuming you already know everything about me. Something about the way she said it unsettled him, because for the first time in years, Zaid realized he might have met someone he couldn't predict, someone he couldn't control. And that intrigued him more than he was willing to admit. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the pristine white sands of the island. The ocean stretched out endlessly, shimmering under the heat, but inside the villa, the air was thick with something else. An unspoken tension neither Zaid nor Amina acknowledged. They had managed to keep their agreement of civility, yet there was an underlying current between them, something neither had expected nor knew how to control. Zaid spent the morning buried in work, his laptop open in front of him as he reviewed reports from his company in Dubai. Numbers, contracts, expansion plans, everything that should have held his focus. But it didn't. Not when, every so often, his thoughts drifted to her. She had spent the morning exploring again, taking in the beauty of the island without a care in the world. While he was shackled to his responsibilities, she moved freely, completely unbothered by the circumstances that had forced them together. And for some reason, that irritated him. By the time the afternoon rolled in, Zaid decided he needed to reclaim some sense of control. He found Amina by the water, her toes sinking into the wet sand as small waves lapped at her feet. She was dressed in a simple yet elegant sundress, her hair tied back in a way that exposed the graceful curve of her neck. He approached, hands in his pockets, watching as she continued to stare out at the ocean, lost in thought. You seem to be enjoying yourself, he remarked, his voice neutral. She glanced at him, a smirk playing at her lips. Why wouldn't I? This island is beautiful. Zaid crossed his arms. Most people in your position wouldn't be so at ease. Amina turned fully to face him, one eyebrow arched. And what position is that? A forced marriage, a honeymoon with a husband who wants nothing to do with you. She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. Sheikh Zaid, I learned a long time ago that life doesn't always go the way we want. But you can either waste time fighting it or find a way to make the best of it. Her words, though simple, hit something deep within him. All his life, Zaid had fought. He had fought for control, for power, for the ability to carve his own destiny. And yet, here was this woman, completely unfazed by the very thing that had left him simmering with resentment. Is that how you see this? He asked, stepping closer. Making the best of a bad situation? She met his gaze directly. Yes, but I don't expect you to do the same. Zaid studied her, frustrated by how unaffected she seemed. He wanted to break past that calm exterior, to understand what was behind it. And for the first time since the wedding, he felt the undeniable pull of curiosity. That night, dinner was served in their villa, an intimate setting with dim lighting and the sound of the ocean filling the silence between them. The table was set for two, candles flickering, the aroma of grilled seafood and spiced rice filling the air. Zaid had fully intended to eat quickly and retreat to his work. But something about the evening felt different. Amina sat across from him, her expression unreadable as she slowly sipped a glass of wine. You've been quiet, she noted after a while. He set his fork down, meeting her gaze. I don't make conversation just to fill silence, she smirked. Of course you don't. You strike me as the type of man who only speaks when there's something to gain from it. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. And what about you? You strike me as a woman who enjoys making men uncomfortable. Amina laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Only the ones who think they're untouchable. For the first time since they met, Zaid found himself smiling. Not out of politeness, not out of amusement, but out of something deeper. Something he wasn't quite ready to name. A silence stretched between them, heavier this time, charged with something unspoken. Finally, Amina set her glass down and stood. I think I'll take a walk before bed. Zaid watched her move toward the door, hesitating for a moment before speaking. I'll join you. Amina glanced over her shoulder, surprised, but she didn't argue. They walked in silence along the shoreline, the cool night breeze wrapping around them. The sky above was littered with stars, the moon casting a soft glow on the waves. For once, Zaid didn't feel the need to speak. For once, he was content with just existing in the moment. And for the first time since this forced marriage began, he wondered if, perhaps, this honeymoon wouldn't be as unbearable as he had expected. The night air was crisp and warm, carrying the scent of the ocean as Zaid and Amina walked side by side along the shoreline. Their footsteps left imprints in the soft, damp sand, only to be erased moments later by the gentle waves rolling in. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them was not awkward, but rather charged, like an invisible force pulling them together, yet keeping them apart. Zaid had never been one for casual walks or idle conversations, yet here he was, walking under the moonlight with the woman he had married against his will. Amina was the first to break the silence. So, tell me something, she said, her voice calm but curious. What was your plan before all of this? Zaid glanced at her. Before what? Before your father forced you into marriage. He let out a dry chuckle. I was going to continue living exactly as I had been, expanding my business, traveling when I wanted, answering to no one. She nodded, as if that answer didn't surprise her. And marriage was never in the equation? No. He didn't hesitate. Not like this, at least. Amina kicked at the sand lightly, watching as small grains scattered into the air. I suppose I should be offended. He raised an eyebrow. Why? Because you make it sound like marrying me is the worst thing that could have happened to you. Zaid stopped walking. Amina took a few more steps before realizing he was no longer beside her. When she turned to face him, his expression was unreadable. I don't mean it like that, he said, his voice lower now. She crossed her arms. Then how do you mean it? Zaid exhaled slowly, looking out at the dark ocean. I've spent my entire life in control of everything. Who I do business with, where I live, who I allow into my life. And then, suddenly, that control was taken away. He turned back to her. It's not about you, Amina. It's about the fact that I had no choice. For the first time, something in Amina's expression softened. She studied him for a moment before speaking. You think I had a choice? Zaid frowned. He hadn't considered that. Amina sighed, looking out at the horizon. My family expects perfection. For years I followed their rules, did everything they asked of me. And just when I thought I had carved out a life of my own, they arranged this marriage. No discussion, no consideration for what I wanted. Zaid had assumed she was indifferent, unaffected by their situation. But now, for the first time, he saw it, the quiet resentment in her eyes. I was sent to a man I didn't know, she continued. A man who looked at me like I was a burden, like I was something he had to endure. She shook her head. So trust me, Zaid, you are not the only one who lost control over their life. For a moment, he said nothing. He had been so consumed by his own frustration that he never once thought about how she felt. They stood there, the waves rolling in, the moonlight casting soft shadows on their faces. Then, to his surprise, Amina smiled. Just slightly. But since we're stuck with each other, I think we should at least try to be civil. Zaid smirked. I thought we already agreed to that. Yes, but I mean more than just tolerating each other. She took a step closer, her gaze challenging. We can spend the next 2 weeks pretending this marriage doesn't exist. Or we can try to understand each other. See if maybe, just maybe, we don't hate each other as much as we think. Zaid watched her, his sharp mind weighing the proposition. He had spent the last few days resisting her, resenting her presence. But what if he stopped? What if, for the first time in his life, he let go of control just enough to see where this went? Finally, he nodded. Fine. Amina smiled wider this time, something genuine behind it. Good. They resumed their walk, this time side by side, the distance between them smaller than before. And for the first time since their wedding, Zaid found himself wondering, what if this marriage wasn't just an obligation? What if it could be something more? The following morning, Zaid woke up earlier than usual. The villa was quiet, the only sound coming from the waves gently lapping against the shore outside. He sat up in bed, rubbing his temples as he recalled the conversation from the night before. Amina had surprised him. For days he had assumed she was nothing more than a woman forced into his life, an inconvenience he had to tolerate. But last night, for the first time, he had seen beyond that. He had seen her strength, her quiet defiance, and the weight of her own sacrifices. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, that unsettled him. After a quick shower, he dressed in light linen pants and a white shirt, leaving the top buttons undone. As he stepped outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the island. Amina was already awake, sitting on the terrace with a cup of coffee in her hands. She was dressed in a simple, off-the-shoulder dress, her skin glowing under the morning light. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "You're up early." Zaid sat across from her. "Couldn't sleep." She nodded as if she understood. "Neither could I." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't the heavy, uncomfortable kind. It was something else, something neither of them was ready to name. The chef arrived moments later, serving them a breakfast of fresh fruit, warm pastries, and Arabic coffee. They ate quietly, stealing occasional glances at each other but saying little. It wasn't until they finished eating that Amina set her fork down and spoke. "So, what does a man like you do for fun?" Zaid smirked. "You assume I have time for fun?" She rolled her eyes. "Let me guess. Your idea of relaxation is reading stock reports and checking your company's growth charts." He chuckled. "Something like that." Amina shook her head. "That's sad." He arched an eyebrow. "And what do you do for fun, then?" She leaned back in her chair. "I paint." That surprised him. "Paint?" "Yes." She took a sip of her coffee. "I studied business to make my family happy, but if it were up to me, I'd spend all my time painting." Zaid watched her, noticing how her eyes lit up at the mention of it. He had never been the artistic type, never had the patience for things that couldn't be measured in profits and losses, but the way she spoke about it made him curious. "You must be good," he said. Amina smirked. "I am." He found himself smiling. "Confident, aren't you?" "Always." For the first time, their conversation flowed easily, without the usual tension. And for the first time, Zaid didn't feel the need to keep his walls up. That afternoon, as they walked along the beach, Amina suddenly turned to him. "Let's do something spontaneous." Zaid raised an eyebrow. "Spontaneous?" "Yes." She gestured toward the ocean. "Swim with me." He looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "You want me to jump into the ocean?" "Yes." She grinned. "What's the matter, Sheikh? Afraid of a little water?" Zaid scoffed. "I'm not afraid of anything." Amina stepped closer, challenging him. "Then prove it." Before he could argue, she pulled her dress over her head, revealing a black bikini underneath. She tossed the dress onto a lounge chair before running toward the water, laughing as the waves splashed against her legs. Zaid watched her, shaking his head. She was reckless, unpredictable. And yet, he found himself mesmerized. With a deep breath, he unbuttoned his shirt, tossing it aside before following her into the water. The moment he stepped in, Amina splashed him, laughing. "Too slow," he smirked. "You shouldn't have done that." Before she could react, he lunged forward, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her into the deeper part of the water. She gasped, gripping his shoulders for balance. For a moment, they were chest to chest, close enough to feel each other's warmth despite the coolness of the water. Amina's laughter faded, replaced by something else, something unspoken. Zaid's grip on her tightened just slightly, his eyes locked onto hers. The air between them changed, heavy with an unfamiliar tension. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. And in that moment, Zaid knew. This marriage was no longer just an obligation. It was something else entirely. That night, Zaid found himself restless. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in the water over and over again. He had felt Amina's body pressed against his, had seen the way her laughter had faded into something more serious, more intense. And he had wanted to kiss her. The thought should have irritated him. This marriage was supposed to be a contract, nothing more. But Amina was proving to be more than just an inconvenience. She was a force he hadn't expected, a challenge he couldn't ignore. Frustrated, he threw off the sheets and stepped onto the balcony, inhaling the salty night air. The moon reflected on the water like silver silk, and down below he saw Amina sitting near the shoreline, her feet buried in the sand. Without thinking, he made his way down to her. She didn't turn when he approached, but she knew he was there. "Can't sleep?" Zaid sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin. "Neither can you." Amina sighed, hugging her knees. "Too many thoughts." He glanced at her. "About what?" She hesitated before answering. "About us." Zaid's chest tightened. He had expected her to dance around the subject, the way they had been doing for days. But Amina was bold. She always spoke her mind, even when he wasn't ready to hear it. "What about us?" he asked, his voice lower now. She turned to face him. "This wasn't supposed to happen, was it?" He knew what she meant, the tension, the way they had started to see each other as more than just strangers forced into marriage. "No," he admitted. Amina exhaled, staring out at the water. "I spent the first few days hating this. Hating you. Hating the fact that my life was taken out of my hands." Zaid watched her closely. "And now?" She met his gaze, her eyes searching his. "Now, I'm not so sure." The air between them felt charged, like something was about to shift. Zaid's fingers twitched, resisting the urge to reach for her. "Tell me something," she said. "If we had met under different circumstances, if this marriage hadn't been arranged, would you have ever looked at me?" Zaid's throat went dry. The easy answer would have been no, to pretend that nothing about her intrigued him. But he was done lying to himself. "Yes," he said, his voice rough. "I would have." Amina's breath hitched just slightly, but she didn't look away. For the first time, Zaid allowed himself to really look at her, to admire the way the moonlight made her skin glow, the way her full lips parted as if she was on the verge of saying something, but didn't. Without thinking, he reached out, brushing a loose curl from her face. Amina didn't pull away. He leaned in, just slightly, enough to feel the heat between them. But then, she whispered, "Zaid." It wasn't a rejection. It wasn't encouragement. It was a question, a hesitation, and that hesitation made him stop. Zaid pulled back, clenching his jaw. "We should go inside." Amina blinked, as if coming back to reality. She nodded slowly. "Yes, we should." Neither of them moved right away. Then, finally, she stood, dusting off the sand from her dress, before walking toward the villa. Zaid followed, his mind a storm of emotions. He had come down here seeking clarity. Instead, he had found himself standing on the edge of something dangerous. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to step back or fall completely. The next morning, everything felt different. Zaid and Amina moved around each other carefully, as if acknowledging something unspoken, but refusing to address it. The tension from the night before lingered between them, heavy and undeniable. Breakfast was quiet, filled with stolen glances and unsaid words. Zaid found himself distracted, unable to focus on his usual routine. He had spent years mastering control over his business, his life, his emotions, but Amina had undone him in a matter of days. By the afternoon, a storm rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the blue sky. The wind howled, the ocean growing restless. Rain hammered against the windows of the villa, trapping them inside. Amina stood by the glass doors, watching the storm with fascination. "It's beautiful," Zaid scoffed. "It's a storm." She smiled, shaking her head. Even storms have their own kind of beauty. Something about the way she said it struck him. She turned to face him then, her expression softer than before. "Tell me, Zaid, are you still so certain that this marriage was the worst thing to happen to you?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, because for the first time, he wasn't sure. Amina took a step closer, closing the distance between them. Her fingers brushed against his wrist, hesitant but deliberate. Zaid swallowed hard, his pulse quickening, and then, finally, he gave in. He reached for her, pulling her into his arms. Their lips met in a kiss that was slow, intense, filled with everything they had been holding back. The storm raged outside, but inside, everything finally made sense. Because this wasn't just obligation anymore. This was real, and neither of them could fight it any longer.